Okay, I want to make a few comments on this debate that took place on the 7th of this month, 7th of April 2011. The debate was entitled, Is Good from God? And it featured William Lane Craig. Somebody who, if you come up against, by Christ, you need to be well prepared, don't you? Because he will be. There's no question about that. He knows what you're going to say, and he knows what he's going to say in response to what you're going to say. And this is why it's between William Lane Craig and Sam Harris, who's somebody else who prepares quite well for things, presents arguments very, very well as just about anybody from my perspective. This was an interesting debate for me because what they were debating was objective morality, whether God gives us objective morality, whether atheism could give us objective morality. They weren't debating whether God actually existed. I don't agree with William Lane Craig on this or just about anything, but on this particular point I didn't really agree with Sam Harris either. I don't agree with this idea that you can manage to get some kind of objective morality from an atheistic standpoint any more than you can from any other standpoint. Now, I did understand Sam Harris's argument. I thought he enunciated it very well, and I kind of understood the point he was making about having to make some kind of presupposition, some kind of axiomatic statements for whatever your philosophical or scientific standpoint. I understood that point. I just felt that his standpoint was a little too contrived to count as such a statement and still regarded as objective. And I really have this. Well, we'll come into the old subjective thing at the end. What I want to do instead is I felt the whole debate was fielded a little bit too much. It was like a football match where a soccer match, if you like, where all the play is in one half of the pitch, which happens sometimes, and Harris was very much, the term is, playing on the counter. The attacks that he made was sort of from deep in defence, surging forward on the wing and trying to make a counter. Whereas it really didn't need to be that way, because it seemed that the whole half of the debate was almost ignored, and the half that was ignored was the half that Craig was making. Craig was making this claim that having a deity could give you objective morality. That was the claim that he was making, and he claimed that that's all he was making, and so that any reference, because Harris did make some references to Abrahamic scripture, to Jewish scripture, to Christian scripture, and Craig just dismissed them out of hand and said, "Whoa, I'm not talking about the Abrahamic deity here. This is general." But this was bullshit on Craig's part, to be quite frank. The idea that his position, at one point he said his position sort of would apply to anybody, even deists. He even mentioned deists, but this was absolute crap. He was talking about a personal monotheistic deity. These are all things that he brought up himself that was worthy of worship, and most specifically omnibenevolent. That is a very, very specific claim to make and applies to very, very few deities that have ever been worshipped. So to have this kind of an omniscient, omnibenevolent deity of the type he was talking about, I only know one example of a deity that's like that, and that's the Judeo-Christian the Abrahamic deity, the God of the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. That's the only one of those that I know. So I thought that was a bit disingenuous of Dr. Craig there, but he maintained that position so that he couldn't really be challenged on any scriptural or doctrinal specifics. So I felt that he was having his cake and eating it there. But these were some of the things that I want to go through that either Craig wasn't challenged on. Some of the ways, what I want to talk about is the ways that the game could have been played in the other half of the pitch, perhaps a bit more than it was. And, you know, I'm not blaming Harris for this. I thought he did very, very well, and I thought that the honours were very much even in this debate. I appreciated the points that Harris made more. I thought they made more sense a lot of the time, but then I'm an atheist. But there were some points that Craig made which Harris didn't really respond to or tried to avoid very well. Craig is a very, very good debater, and he'd obviously done his homework as he always did. So I'd like to say kind of honours even on it. But these are the things that Craig wasn't really challenged on. A couple of them Harris glossed over, and I thought, well, why aren't you making more of this? The first was, why would God necessarily be good? I could understand why Craig wants to portray God as necessarily good. He has a vested interest in it. He is a Christian, which although purportedly irrelevant to this debate, he is trying to say that we need objective morality, and that objective morality is going to be a really, really great thing. So for that to be the case, it's very important that we smuggle in this idea that whatever objective morality we get from God, it's going to be good, because let's be honest, if it's an objective morality, we're going to be fucking stuck with it, aren't we? So he smuggles this in right at the beginning with this sort of 30-second blast of St. Anselm's ontological argument, which is then twisted round until we get to these perfect characteristics. And the perfect characteristic that he chooses isn't omni-malevolence, it's omni-benevolence, which surely means that you're already presupposing that benevolence is a better characteristic than malevolence. But what is that based on? If this is your initial perspective, I don't understand. There's got to be something pre-existent, it's some sort of pre-existent axiom to presuppose benevolence over malevolence. And in any case, there are various arguments that Harris could have brought up. I know, like me, he's fond of Nick Bostrom's simulation argument. He made it in a debate only recently. He brought that very argument up. He could have brought this argument up here to say to Craig, well, the creator of the universe may be no more benevolent than you and I. He may not be omni-benevolent. He may not be omni-malevolent. He may just be generally benevolent or generally malevolent or entirely disinterested in moral affairs as they pertain to human beings entirely. Never brought it up, never questioned it on that. He just gave Craig an absolutely free rein to assert that God would necessarily be absolutely good and that his morality would be absolutely good. Which then brings me on to the next question, which is, even if we assume that, good from whose perspective? Something that's good from God's perspective might not be good from our perspective. It assumes that God has the same end goals that we have, that something's going to be good from both perspectives. If God made the universe, then presumably he made it for some sort of reason, though quite frankly, I can't think of any possible reason that an omnipotent, omniscient being would have for creating or doing anything at any time ever. But presumably he would have a reason for doing it. And then if we'd have some kind of an end goal, which might mean that his perspective is different to ours. The next question that was never brought up, that could have been pushed in Craig's direction, there was this assumption that Craig makes that if God prescribes something, that if God makes a divine command, that immediately objectifies it and solidifies it as objectively moral. But there was no understanding as to why that would be. Again, this is something else where Harris could have referred to this kind of Nick Bostrom-esque simulation. If we created a virtual world, if I ran a virtual world with virtual sentient agents in it, if I commanded something, would that make it objectively moral, whatever it was that I commanded, or would it not? I can't see on what grounds it makes it objectively moral, the fact that the creator of the universe has decreed something. Which then brings us on to this next thing that could have been brought up, because Craig's firing at Harris this is ought problem, and yet can't Harris fire it back? As it turns out, Craig isn't telling us what God is saying is moral, but let's say we did know what God is saying is moral. That still doesn't tell us what God ought to be saying is moral. Just because God says it is moral to mutilate babies doesn't mean God ought to be saying it is moral to mutilate babies. So why doesn't this same argument apply to God? And to any God, Craig, it would have to be. Don't start invoking Judeo-Christian understanding of God's attributes, because that's irrelevant to this debate. That's not the God that you're defending. You're defending this general amorphous notion of God, of course. So you have to be a little more holistic in your defence. So those were the things that I thought could have been brought up and would have levelled the debate a little bit more. Instead, what Harris did tend to bring up was specifics, biblical specifics, things that were in the Bible that looked quite atrocious. And then Craig just held his hand up and said, well, I don't really have to respond to those because that's not the God I'm defending. Like I say, I think that was a bit of bullshit on his part. He wanted his cake and eating it. But I think Harris could have tackled those same issues, but from a perspective that Craig wouldn't have been able to wheedle out of quite so easily. What was interesting was that both men, and this is me talking now, not looking at the debate as to what could have happened, but just me giving my kind of commentary on the whole thing. Both men seem to see objectivity as in some way superior to subjectivity, and in some way a necessity. Both men could see the danger of not having an objective framework, and that was something that I really can't see myself. And that's something, why is objectivity superior to subjectivity? I can certainly see from Harris's understanding his objectivity as much as it is objectivity, and I disagree with his labelling as such. At least it's based on human experience, on human value, on human worth. And so it's probably not something to be fearful of. It's not something to be scared of. It's not necessarily inferior to a subjective approach. But look at Craig's position. Look at Craig vaunts his divine command inspired objectivity as something that we should welcome, as something not to be fearful of. And yet that very, very much depends on some very tenuous presuppositions. It depends on the first perspective on God being omnibenevolent, or at least generally very benevolent, which is a presupposition. If God is not benevolent, then these divine commands, these moral diktats that come down from God could be horrible things, could be terrible things. And what Craig is saying is, well, they would be morally objective and we would be bound by them, however terrible they were. But let's not assume that. Let's assume that God is benevolent. I still don't see it as a very edifying position to be in. It's still based on this narcissistic assumption that this kind of objective morality that this benevolent deity is going to give us is pretty much going to chime in with our own present moral sensibilities. Not the moral sensibilities of 50 years ago, mind, or the moral sensibilities of 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. Not the moral sensibilities of people who live in parts of the Middle East, who live in parts of Africa, who live in parts of South America. Not the moral sensibilities of anybody other than ourselves. Because let's be honest, if it was anybody else's moral sensibilities, we'd be horrified that suddenly we'd have to adopt or change our own moral perspective to a moral perspective that we don't actually agree with. And this is the problem, that even if God is inherently benevolent, that the solutions that he arrives at might be solutions that are very, very distasteful from our perspective, even though morally justified from his perspective. For example, I regard it as perfectly moral that when a physically or mentally handicapped child is born, that we do the best by that child. and that we spend extra money and extra resources to try and fund that child's existence and for it to make the best of its life. Perhaps God in his benevolence may arrive at a different conclusion, that it would be best to euthanize in his perspective, or murder in my perspective, that child as soon as we possibly could. You know, we know that people are getting to breeding age with genetic defects that previously wouldn't have done. We accept that, and at some stage we're going to have to find some kind of, probably engineer some kind of genetic solution thousands of years down the line to stop these becoming bigger and bigger problems. But perhaps God would have a different solution. Perhaps God's solution would be that anybody who had a serious genetic defect would be sterilized, that the moral thing to do would be to sterilize them before they had the chance to reproduce. So how would we feel about these objective moral decrees if God was to make them? Of course, Craig would wave it away and say, oh, God wouldn't make that kind of moral decree. No, of course, William Lane Craig, the only moral decrees God would make would be moral decrees that chime with your own personal morality. But this is the thing, you know. While we've got subjective morality, we are free to choose, we are free to decide, to debate, to formulate a moral framework that appeals to the majority of us, that we are happy with. We can reach some kind of consensus on what we wish to regard as moral. Once you've got an objective framework, then you're shafted. You're stuck with whatever you've got, and you're stuck with whatever you've got for all time. If anybody can convince me that that kind of objective morality is in some way superior to subjective morality, well, I wish you good luck. Fabulous debate. I'll put a link to this debate. It's 2 hours long, well worth watching. Thank you for watching this video, listening to my thoughts on the debate. Bye for now.